Welcome to Unearthed Truths, the channel where we dig deep into history's hidden corners and bring forgotten facts back to life. If you're curious about the past, hungry for the untold, and love discovering the strange and fascinating details that textbooks often leave out, you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe, because what we uncover here will change how you see history. Today's episode takes us back to the earliest days of the American presidency, but not the polished version you might know. This is exactly how the first leaders of the United States shocked history with odd habits, quiet rebellions, and strange coincidences that shaped the nation. The early American presidency was not merely a political office, it was an experimental venture into uncharted governmental territory. When the Constitutional Convention concluded in 1787, the framers had created something unprecedented: a Republican executive who would wield significant power while remaining accountable to the people. The first few presidents would not just govern, they would define what it meant to be President of the United States. The period from 1789 to 1841 encompassed the administrations of 9 presidents, each contributing unique elements to the evolving institution of the presidency. These men faced challenges that no constitutional framework could fully anticipate. How much power should a president wield? How should they interact with foreign nations? What precedents would bind their successors? Their answers to these questions would echo through American history. George Washington holds the unique distinction of being the only president who never resided in the White House. When he assumed the presidency on April 30, 1789, the nation's capital was New York City, and the presidential residence was a modest mansion at 3 Cherry Street, later moving to a larger house on Broadway. The decision to establish a permanent federal city along the Potomac River wasn't made until 1790, as part of a complex political compromise orchestrated by Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. The Residence Act of 1790 designated a 10-mile square along the Potomac as the site for the new federal city, but construction would take years. Washington personally oversaw the selection of the exact location and worked closely with Pierre Charles L'Enfant on the city's design. However, construction of the President's House, as it was then known, didn't begin until 1792, and wasn't completed until 1800. Washington's involvement in planning his successor's residence was meticulous. He reviewed architectural plans, insisted on quality materials, and even suggested modifications to ensure the building would properly represent American dignity and Republican values. He envisioned a residence that would be grand enough to command respect from foreign dignitaries while remaining modest enough to reflect democratic principles. During his presidency, Washington moved the seat of government from New York to Philadelphia in 1790, where he lived in the President's House on High Street, now Market Street. This 3-story brick mansion became the template for presidential entertaining and official functions. Washington established formal dinner parties, levees, public receptions, and other ceremonial functions that would influence presidential protocol for generations. The irony of Washington's situation wasn't lost on his contemporaries. Here was the man who had led the nation to independence, established the presidency, and literally planned the federal city, yet he would never sleep in the house that symbolized executive power. When he left office in March 1797, Washington retired to Mount Vernon, where he died on December 14, 1799, almost exactly 1 year before John Adams would become the first president to occupy the White House. Washington's presidency was marked by personal struggles that history often glosses over. Despite his towering reputation, he was deeply insecure about his intellectual abilities compared to contemporaries like Jefferson, Hamilton, and Adams. He had little formal education and was acutely aware of his limitations in classical learning, philosophy, and foreign languages. His dental problems were legendary and deeply affected both his appearance and his confidence. By the time he became president, Washington had lost most of his natural teeth. Contrary to popular myth, his dentures were not made of wood but crafted from a combination of human teeth, possibly from slaves, animal teeth, and ivory. These primitive dental appliances caused him constant pain, altered his facial appearance, and affected his speech patterns. Washington's famous reserve and dignity partially stemmed from his efforts to hide his dental issues. He spoke carefully and deliberately, not just for gravitas but to manage his discomfort. His portraits from the presidential years show a man with a slightly sunken mouth and fuller cheeks, the result of cotton stuffing he used to fill out his face. The first president also struggled with a violent temper that he worked hard to control. His correspondence reveals a man constantly battling his own passionate nature. Thomas Jefferson later wrote about witnessing Washington's tremendous rages describing scenes where the president would curse until the windows shook. Yet Washington's public persona remained unflappable, a testament to his extraordinary self-discipline. Washington's farewell address, published on September 19, 1796, stands as one of the most influential documents in American political history. However, few realize that Washington didn't write it alone. The address was a collaborative effort between Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, with Hamilton doing most of the actual writing. The process began in 1792 when Washington first considered retiring after one term. Madison drafted an initial farewell message that was never used when Washington decided to serve a second term. 4 years later, Washington retrieved Madison's draft and worked with Hamilton to create the final version. The address warned against several dangers that Washington saw threatening the young republic: the spirit of party, the dangers of foreign alliances, the threat of sectionalism, and the importance of religion and morality in public life. His warning about the baneful effects of the spirit of party proved remarkably prescient, as political parties would dominate American politics within years of his departure. Washington's concerns about foreign entanglements reflected his understanding of America's vulnerable position. The young nation lacked the military and economic strength to honor extensive foreign commitments, and Washington feared that permanent alliances would drag America into European conflicts that served no American interest. The address also revealed Washington's deep anxiety about national unity. He had witnessed firsthand how sectional differences and economic interests could tear the nation apart. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 had shown him how quickly internal divisions could threaten the government's authority. Every action Washington took as president set a precedent for his successors. His decision to voluntarily step down after 2 terms established a tradition that lasted until Franklin Roosevelt, and was later codified in the 22nd Amendment. His creation of a cabinet system, his approach to executive privilege, and his methods of conducting foreign policy all became templates for future presidents. Washington's Neutrality Proclamation of 1793 established the principle that the president could make foreign policy decisions without explicit congressional approval. When war broke out between Britain and France, Washington declared American neutrality despite the 1778 alliance with France, setting a precedent for executive independence in foreign affairs. His handling of the Whiskey Rebellion demonstrated federal authority in a way that the Articles of Confederation had never allowed. When Pennsylvania farmers violently resisted the federal excise tax on whiskey, Washington personally led federal troops to suppress the rebellion. This action proved that the new government had both the will and the power to enforce its laws. John Adams holds the distinction of being the first president to live in the White House, but his experience was far from pleasant. When Adams and his wife Abigail moved into the president's house in November 1800, the building was still under construction and barely habitable. The mansion was a construction site masquerading as a residence. Only 6 rooms were considered finished enough for occupancy, and most lacked basic amenities. There was no running water, inadequate heating, and the famous East Room was so unfinished that Abigail hung the family's laundry there to dry. The grounds were a muddy construction zone littered with building materials and waste. Adams wrote to his daughter describing the residence as habitable, but hardly comfortable. The building was damp, drafty, and expensive to heat. Firewood was scarce and costly, and the primitive heating system struggled against the building's poor insulation. Abigail complained that she needed fires in every room just to stay warm, straining their personal finances. The location added to their misery. The new federal city was essentially a swamp with a few government buildings scattered among tree stumps and muddy roads. There were no shops, restaurants, or cultural amenities that the Adamses had enjoyed in Philadelphia. Getting supplies required lengthy trips over poor roads, and social isolation was constant. Despite these hardships, Adams recognized the symbolic importance of occupying the president's house. His famous prayer, inscribed on the mantelpiece in the state dining room, reflected his hopes for both the residents and the nation. "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." Adams's final months in office were marked by one of the most controversial acts in early presidential history: the appointment of the midnight judges. After losing the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, Adams spent his last weeks in office appointing Federalist judges to newly created positions, hoping to maintain some influence over the federal judiciary. The Judiciary Act of 1801, passed by the lame duck Federalist Congress, created 16 new federal judgeships and numerous justice of the peace positions. Adams worked feverishly to fill these positions with loyal Federalists, signing commissions until late into the night before Jefferson's inauguration. This episode revealed Adams's deep fears about Jefferson's presidency and the future of Federalist principles. He genuinely believed that Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party would dismantle the federal government's authority and lead the nation toward chaos. His midnight appointments were a desperate attempt to preserve what he saw as essential governmental stability. However, Adams's actions also established an important precedent for the peaceful transfer of power. Despite his political maneuvering, he quietly left Washington before Jefferson's inauguration, becoming the first president to transfer power to a political opponent. His departure was gracious indeed if not in spirit, establishing the tradition that American presidents would yield office peacefully regardless of their personal feelings about their successors. Adams's presidency was dominated by foreign policy crises that tested both his leadership and the nation's resolve. The XYZ affair of 1797 to 1798 brought America to the brink of war with France and defined Adams's legacy as a president who chose peace over popular war fever. When Adams sent diplomats to France to resolve growing tensions, French officials demanded bribes before negotiations could begin. The American envoys, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry, were approached by French agents, later identified as X, Y, and Z in diplomatic correspondence, who demanded $250,000 in personal bribes and a $12 million loan to France. The American response was swift and indignant. Pinckney's alleged reply, "No, no, not a sixpence," later popularized as "millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," captured American outrage. When Adams released the diplomatic correspondence, war fever swept the nation. Congress authorized naval expansion, created the Department of the Navy, and began preparations for war. The quasi-war that followed saw American and French ships engaging in undeclared naval combat from 1798 to 1800. American naval victories boosted national pride, but Adams recognized that full-scale war would devastate the young nation's economy and potentially destroy its independence. Despite enormous pressure from his own Federalist Party, Adams chose diplomacy over war. He sent new envoys to France in 1799, leading to the Convention of 1800 that ended the quasi-war. This decision likely cost Adams re-election but saved the nation from a potentially catastrophic conflict. The war crisis with France provided the context for one of the most controversial legislative packages in American history, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. These 4 laws expanded presidential power, restricted immigration, and criminalized criticism of the federal government. The Naturalization Act extended the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 to 14 years, targeting French and Irish immigrants who typically supported Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. The Alien Friends Act authorized the president to deport any non-citizen deemed dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. The Alien Enemies Act allowed the deportation of citizens from nations at war with America. Most controversial was the Sedition Act, which criminalized false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government, Congress, or president. The law was clearly designed to silence Republican criticism, and it was selectively enforced against Democratic Republican newspaper editors and politicians. Adams's support for these acts revealed his deep anxiety about national security and political opposition. He genuinely believed that French agents were working to undermine American independence and that domestic opposition was treasonous. However, his administration's enforcement of the Sedition Act became a political disaster that helped ensure his electoral defeat in 1800. The acts prompted the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, secretly written by Jefferson and Madison, which argued that states could nullify unconstitutional federal laws. This crisis established important precedents about the limits of federal power and the role of political opposition in a democracy. Thomas Jefferson's role as primary author of the Declaration of Independence is well known, but his extreme reluctance to speak publicly remains one of history's most intriguing contradictions. The man who wrote, "All men are created equal," was so painfully shy that he rarely spoke in Congress and delivered only 2 public speeches during his 8-year presidency. Jefferson's contemporaries frequently commented on this paradox. John Adams noted that Jefferson was so prompt, frank, explicit, and decisive upon committees and in conversation, but during the whole time I sat with him in Congress, I never heard him utter 3 sentences together. This wasn't mere preference. Jefferson suffered from what would today be recognized as severe social anxiety. His discomfort with public speaking shaped his entire political career. As Secretary of State under Washington, Jefferson communicated primarily through written correspondence and relied on allies like Madison to present his views in public forums. His presidential inaugural addresses were read aloud by clerks rather than delivered personally, breaking with the precedent established by Washington and Adams. This limitation forced Jefferson to become one of history's most effective written communicators. His letters, numbering over 18,000 that survive today, constitute a masterwork of political philosophy, practical governance, and personal reflection. His ability to articulate complex ideas in elegant prose compensated for his speaking deficiencies and may have actually enhanced his historical influence. Jefferson's written advocacy for religious freedom, democratic principles, and individual rights reached audiences far beyond any speech could have achieved. His summary view of the rights of British America, 1774, established his reputation as a powerful writer before he ever set foot in Congress. The Declaration itself was chosen for revision by the Continental Congress precisely because of Jefferson's proven ability to express revolutionary ideas in compelling language. Jefferson's purchase of Louisiana from France in 1803 represents one of the most significant presidential decisions in American history, but it also created his greatest constitutional crisis. The acquisition doubled the nation's size and secured access to the Mississippi River, but Jefferson privately agonized over whether he had the constitutional authority to make such a purchase. As a strict constructionist who believed in limited federal power, Jefferson couldn't find explicit authorization for territorial acquisition in the Constitution. He initially proposed a constitutional amendment to legitimize the purchase, but practical considerations forced him to abandon this approach. Napoleon's offer was time-sensitive, and the strategic importance of New Orleans and the Mississippi River was too great to risk. The negotiations, conducted primarily by Robert Livingston and James Monroe, revealed the unexpected scope of French willingness to sell. Napoleon, facing renewed war with Britain and needing immediate funds, offered the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. This was far beyond what Congress had authorized, but the envoys recognized the unprecedented opportunity. Jefferson's internal struggle over the purchase illuminated the tension between constitutional principle and national interest that would recur throughout American history. His private correspondence reveals a man torn between his philosophical commitments and his presidential responsibilities. Ultimately, he justified the purchase through a broad interpretation of the treaty-making power, effectively abandoning his strict constructionist principles when national interest demanded it. The purchase's implications extended far beyond territorial expansion. It ensured American control of the Mississippi River, vital for Western commerce. It removed a potential French threat from North America. Most importantly, it provided room for the nation's growing population and established the precedent for American continental expansion. Jefferson's second term was dominated by his attempt to use economic coercion as an alternative to war. The Embargo Act of 1807, which prohibited all American exports, was intended to force Britain and France to respect American neutrality during their ongoing conflict. Instead, it nearly destroyed the American economy and Jefferson's political legacy. The policy stemmed from Jefferson's philosophical opposition to war and his belief in the power of economic pressure. As a student of Enlightenment thought, he believed that commercial interdependence would make warfare irrational. The embargo was his attempt to prove that economic weapons could be more effective than military ones. The immediate cause was the Chesapeake Leopard affair of June 1807, when the British warship Leopard fired on the American frigate Chesapeake after the American captain refused to allow a search for British deserters. The attack, which killed 3 Americans and wounded 18 others, created a war crisis that Jefferson hoped to resolve through economic pressure rather than military force. The embargo's effects were catastrophic for American commerce. Exports fell from $108 million in 1807 to $22 million in 1808. New England shipping, the backbone of the regional economy, virtually collapsed. Unemployment soared in port cities, and farmers lost their overseas markets. Smuggling became widespread, forcing Jefferson to use increasingly authoritarian measures to enforce compliance. The policy revealed the limitations of Jefferson's idealistic approach to international relations. European powers proved willing to accept economic hardship rather than yield to American pressure, while Americans bore the full cost of their government's economic warfare. The embargo became so unpopular that Jefferson was forced to sign its repeal on March 1, 1809, 3 days before leaving office. No aspect of Jefferson's life has generated more controversy than his relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman at Monticello. Modern DNA evidence and historical research have largely confirmed what Jefferson's political enemies alleged during his presidency, that he fathered children with Hemmings over a relationship that lasted decades. The story first became public during Jefferson's presidency when James Callender, a disgruntled former ally, published allegations about Jefferson's relationship with Sally, whom he described as Jefferson's slave concubine. Federalist newspapers seized on the story, using it to attack Jefferson's character and highlight the contradiction between his egalitarian principles and his participation in slavery. Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Jefferson's deceased wife Martha, both being daughters of John Wales. She was approximately 14 years old when she accompanied Jefferson's daughter to Paris in 1787, where Jefferson was serving as American minister to France. It was likely during this period that their relationship began. The relationship continued after their return to Monticello and apparently lasted until Jefferson's death in 1826. Hemings bore 6 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. Jefferson freed all of Sally's surviving children, either during his lifetime or in his will, suggesting his acknowledgement of their special status. This relationship illuminates the complex reality of slavery in Jefferson's Virginia and the profound contradictions in his character. The man who wrote that all men are created equal participated in the system of human bondage and exercised the ultimate power of master over slave in the most intimate circumstances. Modern historians recognize that the relationship, while perhaps involving genuine affection, was fundamentally shaped by the power imbalance between master and slave. Hemings could not legally consent to or refuse Jefferson's advances, making any discussion of the relationship inseparable from the broader context of slavery's dehumanizing effects. James Madison's physical stature has become legendary in American history. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing approximately 100 pounds throughout his adult life, he was indeed the smallest president in American history. However, his diminutive size belied an intellectual giant whose ideas shaped the fundamental structure of American government. Madison's frail appearance was a source of constant concern to his contemporaries. He suffered from what he called constitutional weakness, experiencing episodes of what modern doctors might diagnose as anxiety attacks or seizures. These health problems plagued him throughout his life, often confining him to bed for days or weeks at a time. Despite his physical limitations, Madison possessed an extraordinary intellect and an unmatched work ethic. His preparation for the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was legendary among the delegates. He spent months studying the history of confederations and republics, analyzing why previous attempts at republican government had failed, and developing detailed proposals for a new form of government. Madison's extensive notes on the Constitutional Convention provide the most complete record of the proceedings. Writing rapidly throughout the debates, he captured not just the formal speeches but also the informal discussions, personal conflicts, and evolving compromises that shaped the Constitution. His notes, published posthumously, remain the primary source for understanding how the Constitution was created. His intellectual influence extended far beyond the convention. The Virginia Plan, which he largely authored, provided the basic framework for the Constitution. His contributions to the Federalist Papers, particularly Federalist 10 and 51, articulated the theoretical foundation for the new government and remain classics of political theory. Madison's title as Father of the Constitution reflects his central role in both creating and ratifying the document. His Virginia Plan proposed a strong national government with 3 branches: representation based on population, and federal authority over state governments. While the final Constitution differed significantly from his original proposals, the basic structure remained distinctly Madisonian. His greatest contribution was his solution to the problem of faction. In Federalist 10, Madison argued that a large republic would be less susceptible to the tyranny of faction than smaller governments because competing interests would check each other. This insight challenged conventional wisdom that republics could only succeed in small territories and provided the theoretical justification for American continental expansion. Madison's role in creating the Bill of Rights was equally crucial. Initially, he opposed adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, arguing that enumerating specific rights might imply that others didn't exist. However, he came to see the political necessity of amendments to secure ratification and protect individual liberty. As a member of the House of Representatives, Madison drafted the amendments that became the Bill of Rights. His language was careful and precise, balancing protection of individual rights with preservation of governmental authority. The First Amendment's protection of speech, religion, and press, the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches, and the Fifth Amendment's due process protections all bore Madison's careful craftsmanship. His work on the Bill of Rights reflected his evolving understanding of federal power. While he remained committed to effective national government, he recognized that explicit protections for individual rights were necessary to maintain public confidence in the new system. Madison's presidency was defined by the War of 1812, a conflict that tested whether the United States could survive as an independent nation. The war, sometimes called Mr. Madison's War, stemmed from British violations of American neutrality and represented Madison's attempt to defend American honor through military force. The causes of the war were complex and long-standing. British impressment of American sailors, interference with American trade, and support for Native American resistance in the Northwest Territory all contributed to growing tensions. However, the immediate trigger was Madison's belief that war was necessary to preserve American independence and national honor. Madison's decision to seek a declaration of war in June 1812 reflected his evolution from peaceful diplomat to wartime president. Unlike Jefferson, who had tried to avoid conflict through economic coercion, Madison concluded that military force was necessary to compel British respect for American rights. The war's early phases were disastrous for American forces. The invasion of Canada failed miserably, with American armies surrendering at Detroit and suffering defeats along the Niagara frontier. British naval superiority confined American ships to port, while British raids devastated the Chesapeake Bay region. The nadir came in August 1814 when British forces captured Washington, D.C., and burned the White House, Capitol, and other government buildings. Madison and his wife Dolly were forced to flee the capital, and the government's survival was in doubt. The image of the tiny president fleeing the capital as British troops burned the city became a symbol of American weakness. However, American resistance gradually stiffened. Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans, fought after the peace treaty was signed but before news reached America, restored American pride. The successful defense of Baltimore inspired Francis Scott Key to write The Star-Spangled Banner. Most importantly, the United States survived as an independent nation. Madison's presidency marked a significant shift in his political philosophy. The man who had once advocated strict constitutional construction and limited federal power embraced an expanded role for national government in promoting economic development. The War of 1812 had demonstrated American economic weaknesses. The lack of domestic manufacturing forced reliance on British goods even during wartime. Poor transportation systems hindered military logistics and economic development. The absence of a national bank complicated government finance and currency stability. In response, Madison supported what Henry Clay called the American System, a comprehensive program of national economic development. This included chartering the Second Bank of the United States, funding internal improvements like roads and canals, and protecting domestic manufacturing through tariffs. Madison's support for the bank represented a complete reversal of his earlier position. In the 1790s, he had opposed Hamilton's bank as unconstitutional. Now, he argued that experience had proven the bank's necessity for effective government finance. His message to Congress supporting the bank's recharter acknowledged his changed position. The probable operation of a national bank will merit consideration. Similarly, Madison endorsed federal funding for internal improvements, despite his earlier strict constructionist position. The war had demonstrated the military necessity of good transportation networks, and Madison recognized their importance for economic development as well. This shift toward economic nationalism reflected Madison's pragmatic adaptation to changing circumstances. The theoretical framework he had developed in the 1780s and 1790s proved inadequate to the practical challenges of governing a growing nation in a hostile international environment.